300 people were watching my husband hold up a microphone and turn me into a punchline. "Let's start the bidding at $20, he said, grinning at the crowd like he just told the funniest joke of the night. "Who wants this useless wife?" The laughter came fast rolling through the ballroom like it had been waiting for permission. Someone near the back of the room raised a paddle just to keep the joke going. I stood there in the blue dress I'd bought for that very night, and I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply looked at him, then a voice from the back of the room called out, $2 million, and suddenly everything went silent. To understand how I ended up standing on that small stage in front of everyone we knew, you have to know this didn't happen in a single moment. It happened over 27 years, one small dismissal, one quiet compromise at a time, until I became so used to being invisible that I almost didn't notice the night became official. I had spent the entire day organizing that gala. Every centerpiece, every seating chart, every call to the caterer who kept getting the guest count wrong, that was all me. I'd been doing it for 11 years, ever since Gregory's charity foundation had grown beyond backyard dinners into large fundraising events. I never asked for recognition. I convinced myself it was enough to work behind the scenes while someone else stood in the spotlight. Gregory arrived 40 minutes late, just as he always did, walking in with the effortless smile that made every room seem to revolve around him. He kissed me on the cheek in front of the board members, joked about how I always managed to pull everything together, then spent the next hour taking credit for decisions I'd made alone, even down to the choice of wine. I used to resent it. By the past year, I'd mostly stopped caring. You'd be surprised what a person can learn to live with. The jokes began during dinner, as they always did after he'd had a few glasses of his favorite scotch. He told everyone I was old-fashioned, that I still balanced a checkbook by hand, and that I'd probably never sent a text message longer than 4 words. The table laughed. I smiled because that's what I'd learned to do, then passed the bread basket to Mrs. Alderman, who gently patted my hand as if she felt sorry for me. Somehow, that hurt even more than the joke. "She's the least exciting woman in this room," Gregory said loudly enough for several tables to hear. "And I mean that with love." He always added with love, as though those 2 words erased everything that came before them. I don't remember exactly how the auction idea started. I think it was Gregory's business partner, Tom, who'd seen charity bachelor auctions at other fundraising events. Someone joked that it would be funny to do the same thing with married couples. Gregory thought it was hilarious. Halfway through dessert, he grabbed my hand and led me onto the small stage where the band had been playing. For one brief second, I thought he wanted to make a toast, maybe thank everyone, maybe even say something kind. Instead, he took the microphone, rested his hand on my shoulder as though I were something on display, and spoke the words that ended 27 years of pretending I didn't notice. "Let's start the bidding at $20. The room erupted with laughter, the kind that comes easily after too much wine and complete trust in the man holding the microphone. I looked out at nearly 300 faces. People I'd hosted, fed, remembered birthdays for, and written handwritten thank you notes to. Every one of them was laughing. Not one person saw me as anything more than the punchline of the evening. I didn't run off the stage. I didn't throw my wine in his face, even though a small, exhausted part of me desperately wanted to. I simply stood there with my shoulders back, my hands folded, and my head held high. Because I'd learned long ago that dignity is the one thing a room full of laughing people can't take from you unless you give it away yourself. Someone near the back raised a paddle with a grin. $20, they called out, and the laughter grew even louder, and then the room went quiet all at once, the way a room does when something real interrupts something fake. $2 million. The voice came from the back, calm, unhurried, the kind of voice that has never once needed to be loud to be heard. Every head in that ballroom turned at the same time. Gregory's hand slid off my shoulder like it had gone cold. I searched the crowd and found him standing near the entrance, a tall man in a gray suit I did not recognize, watching me with an expression I couldn't yet read. Not pity, not amusement, something closer to reverence, which confused me more than anything else that had happened all night. I had never seen him before in my life. Gregory laughed a short, nervous sound and said something about a generous donor, but nobody was listening to him anymore. The man in gray had already begun walking toward the stage. Unhurried, the whole room parting around him like he was the only person in it who mattered, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt my heart begin to pound. Not with fear, but with the strange, sudden sense that my life was about to change, and I had absolutely no say in how. He stopped a few feet from the stage and looked at me the way you'd look at something you'd been searching for a very long time. Up close, he was older than I'd first thought, maybe 60, with gray at his temples and the kind of quiet stillness that made everyone around him seem too loud by comparison. He didn't look at Gregory at all, he looked only at me. "My name is Daniel Whitmore," he said, and I heard a small collective intake of breath ripple through the crowd behind me. Because apparently that name meant something to everyone in the room except me. "I hope you'll forgive the interruption." Gregory recovered his voice first, stepping forward with his hand extended and that salesman's smile snapping back into place like a light switch. "Daniel Whitmore, of course, we're honored we didn't know you'd be joining us tonight. Your generosity toward the foundation is, I didn't come for your foundation," Daniel said. And his voice was still calm, still, even, but something in it made Gregory's hand drop back to his side without being shaken. "I came because I heard your wife would be here." The room had gone so quiet I could hear the ice shifting in someone's glass 3 tables away. Gregory laughed again, that same nervous sound, and glanced at me like he expected me to explain this, to produce some story that made sense of a strange man offering $2 million for a joke he himself had started. "I'm sorry, have you two met Angela? Do you know Mr. Whitmore?" "No," I said, because it was true, and because I had never once in 27 years given Gregory a reason to doubt my word, and I wasn't about to start in front of 300 people. Daniel turned to me then, and something in his face softened the way a person's face softens when they finally arrive somewhere after a very long drive. "Mrs. Simmons, I know this must feel strange. I promise you it isn't what it looks like." He paused, glanced once at the microphone still dangling from Gregor's hand, and then back at me. "Would you allow me to take you to dinner tomorrow evening? I have something I need to tell you, and it isn't the kind of thing that belongs in a room like this." I should have said no. Every instinct I'd spent decades training told me to say no, to smooth this over, to protect Gregory's evening, even after what he'd just done to me on that stage. But I looked at Daniel Whitmore's face, and I saw something there I hadn't seen, directed at me in longer than I could remember. Not pity, not amusement, not the mild, tolerant affection Gregory offered me on his better days. I saw respect, plain and unembarrassed. "All right," I said, "tomorrow evening." The whispers started before we'd even stepped off the stage. I could hear fragments of it as Gregory guided me back to our table with a hand pressed too firmly against my back. "Who is that? Do you know him?" $2 million for her, and I understood distantly that I had just become the most interesting thing to happen at one of Gregory's galas in 11 years, and not for any reason he would have chosen. He waited until we were in the car, the valet ticket still in his jacket pocket, before he asked the question I could feel building in him the entire ride down in the elevator. "Do you know him?" His voice was tight, careful, a man trying very hard to sound like he wasn't worried. "No, Gregory, I told you the truth in there. I've never met him. $2 million, Angela, for a joke. That's not normal. That's not, people don't do that." He gripped the steering wheel like it owed him an explanation. "What did you do, run into him at the pharmacy, the grocery store, something? I have no idea who he is." I said again, and I meant it, though some part of me had already begun turning the evening over like a stone, looking for the underside of it, the thing I hadn't seen yet. He didn't believe me. I could tell by the way he went quiet for the rest of the drive, and by the way, once we were home, he disappeared into his study instead of coming up to bed. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of that voice from the back of the room. $2 million. I kept searching my memory, trying to place it, but nothing came. I had truly never met the man before. What I didn't know, as I lay in bed with the faint glow of my husband's study light shining beneath the door, was that Gregory had already called his executive assistant, Margaret, from the car. He asked her to find out everything she could about Daniel Whitmore, his business, his past, his marriages, and most importantly, whether there had ever been any connection between Daniel and me. By sunrise, Margaret called Gregory back with something far more unsettling than any affair could have been. Daniel Whitmore had been quietly searching for a woman named Angela Simmons for years. Daniel invited me to a small restaurant I'd never been to before, tucked away on a quiet street far from the places Gregory and I usually visited. The tables were spaced far enough apart that every conversation felt private. He stood as I arrived, pulled out my chair, and waited until we had ordered before speaking. For a long moment, he simply looked at me across the candlelight with an expression I couldn't quite understand. "I want to apologize for last night," he finally said. "I know it must have seemed dramatic. That wasn't my intention. I've been trying to find you for a long time, and when I saw what your husband was doing, I couldn't stand by and watch. You still haven't told me how you know me," I replied. "I've gone through every chapter of my life since last night, and I can't remember ever meeting you." "You wouldn't remember me," he said softly. "But if I tell you the story, I think you'll remember someone else." He took a slow breath, the kind people take before saying something they've carried for years. 30 years ago, you were a young elementary school teacher. Do you remember a rainy afternoon in the fall when you found a teenage girl crying outside the downtown bus station? Something stirred inside me, like an old door slowly opening. "There was a girl," I whispered. "She was about 15 or 16, completely soaked from the rain. I almost kept walking. I had papers to grade and I was exhausted. But she looked so frightened." The memory became clearer. She stood beneath the bus station awning wearing a jacket far too thin for the weather, flinching every time a car slowed near the curb. "I bought her dinner," I said, "at a small diner a few blocks away. Her name was Rachel," Daniel said, his voice catching slightly. "Rachel Whitmore. She was my younger sister." I slowly set down my fork. The restaurant suddenly felt very quiet. "She had run away from our stepfather's house," Daniel continued. "It wasn't safe there. I was already living across the country and didn't realize how bad things had become until it was almost too late." He paused before continuing. "Rachel told me years later that she planned to get on the first bus that came and disappear forever. She didn't care where it was going. She just wanted to escape. Then a stranger sat beside her in the rain and simply asked if she was hungry." More memories came rushing back. I remembered staying with her long after I should have gone home. I remembered calling a trusted contact at County Social Services instead of the general hotline. I remembered sitting in a hard plastic chair until nearly 2 in the morning, refusing to leave until I knew she was somewhere safe. "I visited her at the group home a few times," I said quietly. "I brought her books and checked on her grades. We wrote letters for a couple of years, then I got married, moved twice, and eventually we lost touch. I've often wondered what became of her." Daniel smiled through the sadness. "She became a lawyer. She devoted her life to foster care advocacy. She built a national organization that supported children in group homes, provided legal aid, and created emergency shelters. She always said it all started because one stranger stopped at a diner when she didn't have to." He reached into his jacket and gently placed an unopened envelope on the table. "She passed away 8 months ago," he said. "Cancer." His voice grew quieter. "Before she died, she made me promise her one thing. She said, 'Find the woman from the bus station and tell her she saved my life.'" I covered my mouth with my hand. I hadn't cried in that ballroom the night before, not when people laughed, not during the auction, not even when my own husband put a price on me, but I cried now. In a quiet restaurant I'd never seen before, over a girl I'd almost forgotten, and over a kindness I never imagined had changed someone's entire life. "The $2 million wasn't charity," Daniel said gently. "I need you to understand that. I didn't do it for your husband's foundation, and I certainly didn't do it to embarrass him. Though I confess I didn't mind if it did. I did it because for 30 years everyone in your life has decided what you were worth without ever really looking at you. I wanted just once for a room full of people to see the truth of it." I wiped my eyes with the napkin, my hands unsteady. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything tonight," he said. "Just take this." He slid the envelope toward me. "It's from Rachel. She wrote it before she passed in case I ever found you. I haven't read it. It isn't mine to read." I held the envelope in both hands like it might dissolve if I gripped it too hard. And I understood sitting there with the candle burning low and the rain starting again against the restaurant windows that whatever was inside it was going to change the shape of my life. I just didn't yet know how much. Oh, how. I opened the envelope alone in the guest room where I'd taken to sleeping since the night of the gala, because I couldn't bring myself to read Rachel's last words to me with Gregory's voice carrying through the wall, asking again and again who Daniel Whitmore really was to me. The handwriting was small and careful, a lawyer's handwriting, and it started simply, "Dear Angela, if you're reading this, my brother finally found you, and I hope it wasn't too late. I want you to know that the woman who bought me dinner on the worst night of my life became the reason I believed for the rest of it that strangers could still be kind. Everything I built because of 1 hour you probably don't even remember spending with me. I've left instructions with my attorneys. I hope you'll accept what I'm leaving you not as payment because you never asked for anything, but as proof that kindness doesn't disappear, it multiplies. It just takes a while to come back around. Attached to the letter were legal documents I had to read twice to understand. Rachel hadn't simply left me money. She'd left me a position, a seat on the board of the foundation she'd spent her life building, along with a controlling share of its direction going forward. Leadership, purpose, a say in where hundreds of thousands of dollars went every year toward shelters and legal aid and scholarships for kids like the girl I'd once bought a diner dinner. I sat on the edge of that unfamiliar bed for a long time, holding papers that suddenly made my hands feel like they belonged to someone else. Downstairs, Gregory was building something too, though it wasn't nearly as generous. He'd hired a private investigator by Wednesday, a man named Foster, who specialized, according to Margaret, in matrimonial cases. Gregory was convinced in the particular way a guilty man is often convinced of other people's guilt that Daniel and I had a history he simply hadn't uncovered yet. An affair he assumed something sordid enough to explain $2 million and a private dinner. He wanted proof before I could, in his words, spring anything on him in front of the lawyers. What Foster found instead unsettled him far more than an affair would have. He found teachers I'd worked alongside 20 years earlier, who remembered me keeping granola bars in my desk drawer for the kids who came to school hungry. He found a woman named Diane, a widow I'd sat with every week for 2 years after her husband died, back when Gregory was too busy building his company to notice I'd disappeared most Tuesday afternoons. He found 3 former foster children, now grown, who described a woman who'd shown up at their school plays because no one else would. He found a veteran named Harold who credited me, of all people, with helping him find the paperwork office that finally got his benefits approved after the VA had turned him away twice. None of it was dramatic, none of it was a scandal. It was just decades of small, unremarkable kindnesses that had never once made it into a conversation at Gregory's dinner table, because I had never thought they were interesting enough to mention. And he had never once asked what I did with my time that wasn't spent serving his. Foster's report landed on Gregory's desk the same week the video went viral. I don't know who filmed it, some guest with a phone, probably capturing the auction the way people capture everything now without thinking twice. But by Thursday, the clip of Gregory holding that microphone, grinning, saying, "Let's start the bidding at $20" had been watched 4 million times. The captions people added were not kind to him, neither were the comments. A late-night host mentioned it in his monologue. A women's advocacy account reposted it with the caption, "This is what casual cruelty looks like when it's dressed in a tuxedo," and that version alone crossed 1 million views by Friday morning. Sponsors began calling the company. 2 luxury developers who'd signed contracts with Gregory's firm the previous spring quietly asked their lawyers to review the exit clauses. A journalist who'd covered the gala for a local business magazine reached out to me directly for comment, and I declined because I had nothing prepared to say and no interest in saying anything. Unprepared. Gregory came home Friday evening looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 days. He didn't ask about Daniel. He didn't ask about the envelope I'd been careful to keep locked in the guest room dresser. He sat at the kitchen island with his phone face down in front of him and said very quietly, "It's everywhere, Angela, I can't make it stop." I didn't answer him right away. I thought about Rachel's letter upstairs about the strange, quiet power of 1 honest hour spent with a frightened stranger. And about how differently things might have gone for Gregory if he'd ever once in 27 years wondered what I did with mine. The phone rang before I could decide what to say. Gregory answered it, listened for a long moment, and I watched the last of the color drain out of his face. "The board wants an emergency meeting," he said, "Monday morning, all of them." The board meeting lasted 90 minutes, and Gregory told me about it that night in pieces, the way a man described something he's still too stunned to organize into a full story. 7 directors sat around the long table in the glass-walled conference room. He'd once been so proud of the one with the view of the harbor he liked to show off to new clients. And none of them, he said, would quite look him in the eye. It was Bill Ashford, the oldest of them, who finally said what the rest were thinking. "This isn't about the joke, Gregory. Jokes get forgiven. This is about what the joke told everyone about who you actually are when you think no one important is watching. Two of the luxury developers who'd been circling exit clauses all week made their decision official by Monday afternoon. A hotel group that had been finalizing a contract for a new development pulled out entirely, citing in the careful language of lawyers' concerns about brand alignment. By Wednesday, the company's stock private, as it had lost enough projected value that Gregory stopped mentioning numbers to me at all. He came to me on Thursday with a television offer in his hand, a morning show that wanted them both, Gregory and Angela Simmons, to sit together and set the record straight. He'd already told the producer yes. He asked me to just be there to smile, to tell people it was a joke between us, that I hadn't been hurt, that we were fine. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "I won't lie for anyone anymore, Gregory, not even you," he didn't yell. I think a part of him had already stopped expecting me to say yes to anything he asked. He sank into the kitchen chair, rested his head in his hands, and said nothing. For the first time in years, I felt something close to pity for him, but not enough to change my decision. Later that week, I called Daniel. Not about the interview, but about the envelope, Rachel's letter, and the unexpected weight of responsibility I still wasn't sure how to carry. He didn't pressure me or try to convince me. He simply said, "Take your time, the foundation isn't going anywhere. But if you'd like to see what it really does, I'd be happy to take you to one of the shelters." Before I could overthink it, I heard myself say yes. The shelter was smaller than I'd imagined. A converted apartment building on the edge of town with bright curtains someone had carefully chosen, trying to make a temporary place feel a little more like home. Daniel introduced me to the director, a kind but exhausted woman named Priya. She guided me through the halls, explaining who stayed there, how long they usually remained, and the things they never seemed to have enough of. That's where I met Lena Brooks. She looked about 28, sitting quietly on a bench in the courtyard with a 4-year-old boy asleep against her shoulder, while an older little girl colored beside her. She carried a kind of exhaustion I recognized immediately, not just from lack of sleep, but from spending every ounce of herself making sure her children stayed fed, warm, and unaware of how close they were to losing everything. She glanced up at me with the cautious look of someone who had learned not to expect kindness from strangers. For one brief moment, she reminded me so vividly of a frightened girl standing beneath a bus station awning 30 years earlier that I had to steady myself against the doorway. I sat beside her without asking questions. Instead, I simply asked whether the children had eaten. When she quietly admitted they hadn't eaten since breakfast, I walked to the nearby store, bought sandwiches and juice boxes, and returned to sit with them while they ate, the same way I had once sat across from a scared 15-year-old in a diner, giving her the space to tell her story only when she was ready. When Lena finally began talking, her words came slowly. There was a husband who drank too much, a shelter 3 towns away that had no available beds, and 2 long months spent sleeping in a car before someone finally told her about Priya's shelter. I listened without interrupting, without judging, and without trying to make her story easier to hear. Before I left that afternoon, the foundation arranged to cover Lena's rent for 6 months so she could finally complete the certification course she'd been forced to abandon twice before. Compared to everything Rachel's foundation accomplished, it wasn't a huge gesture, but as I drove home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, perhaps decades. I felt useful, not decorative. Not simply someone filling a seat beside Gregory at another charity gala. Useful. Gregory noticed the change before I ever mentioned the foundation. He noticed it in the way I stopped organizing my life around his schedule. He noticed that I no longer checked my phone for his approval before making decisions. One evening, after I came home late from a foundation meeting, happier than he'd seen me in years, he quietly said, almost to himself, "You don't need any of this anymore, do you, me?" The company, any of it. I didn't answer immediately because I was still discovering the truth myself, but looking at him in the soft kitchen light, I realized he already knew. Maybe he had known ever since that microphone found its way into his hands. A few weeks later, an invitation to Rachel's foundation gala arrived in a cream-colored envelope with my name written in elegant gold lettering. Beneath it was a line I had to read 3 times before I believed it. Keynote speaker, Angela Simmons. I called Daniel immediately, convinced there had been some mistake. "There isn't," he replied with a smile in his voice. The board voted unanimously. They want the founder's story told by the person who unknowingly started it. At first, I almost declined. Standing in front of hundreds of people had never been my strength. I'd spent most of my life doing meaningful work quietly, from the edges of the room rather than the center of the stage. But then I thought about Lena, now 6 months into her certification program, proudly sending me pictures of her daughter's school projects. I thought about Rachel's letter, carefully folded inside my dresser drawer. Kindness never truly disappears. Sometimes it simply takes years to find its way back, so I said yes. On the evening of the gala, I got ready alone in my small apartment, the one I'd moved into 6 weeks after telling Gregory I needed space to figure out who I was. I chose a deep green dress instead of another blue one that reminded me of a different ballroom and a different life. I did my own hair. And for the first time in years, I never once looked at my phone to see if anyone approved. This time, when I entered a ballroom filled with 300 people, I wasn't walking in behind my husband. I was walking toward a stage where my own name was already printed in the program. Daniel met me near the entrance, offered me his arm, and walked beside me the way only an old friend can, steady, patient, and reassuring. "You don't have to give a perfect speech," he whispered. "Just tell them the truth, that's all Rachel ever wanted." When they announced my name, I walked onto the stage with a pounding heart but steady hands. I looked across the audience, donors, board members, volunteers, and many familiar faces from the shelters our foundation now supported across 4 different states. Then I told them about a rainy afternoon outside a bus station, about a diner booth, about a frightened teenage girl I had almost walked past because I was worried about getting back to work. I admitted that at the time it hadn't felt extraordinary, and now I believed that was exactly the lesson. The acts of kindness that change someone's life rarely seem important in the moment they're happening. As I finished speaking, the lights dimmed and a large screen behind me came to life. A woman in her 40s, a former fostered child, shared how a scholarship had helped her become a nurse. Then a man in his 60s, the veteran named Harold, whose story Foster's investigation had uncovered years earlier, spoke about finally receiving the benefits he had nearly given up fighting for. A teacher I hadn't seen in 15 years described the granola bars in my desk drawer, tears running freely down her face as she spoke. And I found I had to press my hand against my mouth to keep my own composure. Lena appeared last, her daughter beside her, saying simply, "She sat with us, that's all." She just sat with us until it didn't feel impossible anymore. I looked out into the dark of the audience and found Gregory sitting near the back alone in a seat he must have requested quietly without fanfare, without expecting to be noticed. He wasn't smiling the way he smiled for cameras. He was simply watching, very still, the way I had once been still on a stage he built for me. After the ceremony, as the crowd thinned and the wait staff began clearing the tables, he found me near the coat check, and he didn't try to charm his way into the moment the way he once would have. "I watched all of it," he said. "The video tonight, all of it. 27 years, Angela, and I never once asked you what you did on your Tuesday afternoons." His voice broke slightly on the word Tuesday, and I understood he was thinking of Diane, the widow, of all the small absences he'd never questioned, because he'd never wondered where I went. "I'm sorry, not the kind of sorry that wants something back, just sorry. I stood beside someone extraordinary for almost 3 decades, and I never once looked up long enough to see her." I believed him. That was perhaps the strangest part of the whole evening, that after everything, I could still recognize the difference between a performance and a genuine reckoning. And this finally was the latter. "Thank you for saying that," I told him, and I meant it. "I forgive you, Gregory. I want you to know that, but forgiveness isn't the same thing as going back." He nodded slowly, like a man finally accepting the shape of something he'd been trying to reshape for weeks. He didn't argue. He didn't ask me to reconsider. He simply stood there in his good suit, looking older than I'd ever seen him look, and let me say good night. I walked out of that gala alone into a cool evening full of the particular quiet that comes after something important has finally been said out loud. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, being alone didn't feel like a loss. It felt like the beginning of something that belonged entirely to me. 6 months passed the way real change usually does, quietly in increments too small to notice until you looked back and saw how far you'd come. Rachel's foundation had grown under my direction in ways I hadn't expected when I first opened that unassuming envelope. We'd opened 2 new shelters, one in a small town that hadn't had emergency housing in over a decade. The scholarship program Rachel started with a handful of recipients each year, now funded 30, mostly kids, aging out of foster care with nowhere steady to land. Lena finished her certification in the spring and started work at a pediatric clinic 3 weeks later. She sent me a photograph of her name badge, Lena Brooks RN, with 3 exclamation points and nothing else. And I kept it taped inside my desk drawer where I'd once kept granola bars for children I never expected to remember me. I had a purpose now that didn't depend on anyone's permission. That was the part I hadn't known to hope for. Gregory resigned as chairman that same spring, and it surprised people who didn't know the whole story, though it didn't surprise me. The board hadn't forced him out, not in the end. The numbers had recovered somewhat by then, the initial outrage cooling the way these things eventually do. He resigned because he told me over coffee, one of the last times we spoke as anything resembling a married couple. He didn't want to spend the second half of his life being a man who'd only learned decency after losing everything that mattered to him. He wanted to rebuild something smaller. He said something honest, even if it meant starting over at 55 with a fraction of what he'd had. We separated with more grace than either of us had shown each other in years. No courtroom shouting, no dividing of assets like weapons in a war. Just 2 people finally honest with each other, signing papers at a lawyer's office and shaking hands afterward like colleagues closing out a long, complicated project. He asked before I left that office for the last time as his wife whether I thought we could have been happy if he'd simply paid attention sooner. I told him I didn't know and that I'd stopped needing to know, and I think that answer surprised him more than anger would have. On a quiet Sunday in early autumn, Daniel and I drove out to the cemetery where Rachel was buried, a modest stone under an oak tree just beginning to turn gold at the edges. Daniel had brought white leaves, her favorite, he told me, and set them carefully against the base of the headstone while I stood a step behind him, giving him the moment alone that grief sometimes needs before it can be shared. When he stepped back, I knelt down myself and rested my hand flat against the cool stone, feeling the carved letters of her name under my palm. "You thought I saved your life," I said quietly, not caring that Daniel could hear me because I think some part of him needed to hear it too. "But I've been thinking about it for months now, and I believe you saved mine right back. I just didn't know it yet. It took 30 years for the debt to come due, and I got the better end of the bargain by far." Daniel didn't say anything, he didn't need to. He simply put his hand briefly on my shoulder, the way you comfort someone who doesn't need comforting so much as company. And we stood there together a while longer in the gold autumn light before turning to walk back toward the car. That was when I saw her, a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, sitting alone on a bench just outside the cemetery gates, a duffel bag at her feet, her arms wrapped around herself against the wind. Though the day wasn't especially cold, she had the particular stillness of someone trying very hard not to be noticed, and the particular fear of someone who has learned that being noticed rarely goes well for her. I recognized that stillness. I had seen it once before 30 years ago under a bus station awning in the rain, and I had carried the memory of it without even realizing for every year since. I didn't hesitate. I walked over, sat down on the far end of the bench, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her, and I asked the only question that had ever mattered in moments like this one. "Would you like to sit with me for a while?" She looked at me, startled, wary, and then slowly something in her shoulders loosened just slightly, the way a held breath finally lets go. She nodded. And the cycle that started with a stranger and a diner booth 30 years ago began again quietly, the way it always had, without an audience, without applause, without anyone keeping score. Sometimes people laugh while they decide your worth. They hold up the microphone, they set the price, they wait for the room to agree with them. But life has a way of letting time settle the real account long after the laughter has faded and the room has emptied out. And when it finally does, you learn the truth of it. Kindness is always worth more than those who mock it could ever afford to pay. I want to know what you think happens to Angela next. Does she ever open her heart to someone new, or has she found everything she needs in the life she's built for herself? Leave a comment below and tell me where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going.